Welcome to Authentic Talks 2.0, the space for real conversations that challenge, uplift, and awaken the seeker in all of us. I'm your host, and today we're peeling back centuries of religious tradition to ask, what is biblical truth really? Joining us is Jodell Onstott, an accomplished author and socio-biblical researcher specializing in comparative, biblical, and ancient Near Eastern studies. Known for her groundbreaking book, Yahweh Exists, Jodell applies rigorous historical, archaeological, and textual analysis to re-examine the foundation of faith as we know it. Her work isn't just academic, it's fearless, thought-provoking, and deeply independent, cutting through tradition to uncover what's buried or ignored. Today, we're diving into her latest release, Does Jesus Exist? The Quest for Biblical Truth and the Suffering Servant of Our Modern World. And this powerful new work investigates whether Jesus represents a continuation of divine law or a departure from it, and how the theological distortion may have reshaped the truth. She's been featured in Tim Mahoney's Patterns of Evidence, as well as on Focus Today, Hebrew Nation Radio, and more. And now she's here with us. Get ready. This is not your typical religious conversation, you guys. This is a deep dive into history, scripture, and uncomfortable but necessary questions. Before we dive in with today's episode and bringing on Jodell, I do want to take a moment to welcome each and every last one of you and extend an open invitation for you to come back again and again. And if you have not subscribed to the show, please hit that subscribe button. That way you won't miss an episode once I upload a show. If you really enjoy these talks, please be sure to share with family members and friends. And please head on over to leave us a review as well. You guys, thank you again for joining us today on Authentic Talks 2.0. Now let's go ahead and get real and dive on in, you guys. Let's get authentic with Jodell Onstott. Authentic Talks is all about authentic conversations. This show is all about growth, love, respect, success, mind, body, and spirit. If you're looking to grow and become your authentic self, then this is the podcast for you. And I am your host, Shanta. Welcome to the show. Hi, Jodell. Welcome to Authentic Talks 2.0. I'm excited to have you here today. Before we dive in, can I have you introduce yourself to our listeners, please?
Sure. It is so fun to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation. I am Jodell Onstott. I have about 30 years into biblical research and history, and I love the pursuit of truth and finding and discovering new things. But more than that, something that benefits society and provides unity to us, and hopefully not just as Americans, but other nations as well. I think our world could use a little bit of that.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. Welcome to the show again. I'm glad that you're here because when I read your book, the fact that you have a new book out, I was very interested in talking with you. I wanted to know so many things that I had to just breathe because I was like, I have a lot of questions. I love that you study truth, being a truth seeker. How far back does the research go? Is it like 1500s or where does it start when you are looking at, when it's a biblical, what is it called? A biblical scholar? Yes.
For me, this is my second book. My second book is Does Jesus Exist? My first book was Yahweh Exists, and this is all part of the Yahweh Exists series. And that one, I went all the way back to the idea of the creation, the flood, and proceeded forward. The real history really begins with Abraham around 2100 BCE, and then with the Exodus, which I date very early, which is around 1550 BCE. And that happens to coincide with the Hyksos expulsion out of Egypt. And there's lots of archaeological evidence. It's so funny because when you get into the discussion, atheists, one of the things that they always use to support their position, there's no evidence for the Exodus. Well, Yeah, if you're looking in the wrong time period, there is not. But if you're looking at the earlier time period, all the evidence is there. It becomes really fun. I call my method of scholarship a Sherlock Holmes method, where I am looking for those details, and those details can make everything fall in place and give it history and context. I just love that.
When you were growing up, you took an interest in the Bible and it made you want to dig. How does someone become a biblical scholar?
So when I was a kid at church, we would have biblical archaeological review in our foyer. I was always picking it up, always looking at it, always fascinated with it. I was going to school for pre-law, so that didn't take me in that direction. But then I began having questions, especially as I got into motherhood. I began having questions with the faith that I inherited because I began to see a lot of contradictions. Those contradictions were not comfortable because I felt like if I gave those issues and those controversies, if I acknowledged them, that somehow my faith would be unpinned. Somehow I would end up in left field. I'd throw everything out and I wouldn't believe in anything. And as I kept digging, I did go through a couple years of struggling with, am I an atheist? Am I not? But as I couldn't let go, tried to walk away, I couldn't because the information is so solid. It's there. And as I kept studying, I'm like, oh my goodness, there's a foundation here. It's a foundation for humanity. We can't ignore this. So it really came to life. In my first book, I put God on trial and I asked specific questions. It really boils down to, is God righteous? Because you can have a God, but if he's not a righteous God, it kind of all falls apart. When you look at a lot of the pagan deities, they acknowledged gods, but they were far from righteous. They got up on the wrong side of the bed, but wiped out 20,000 people.
What were
So,
some of your questions that you had that didn't quite make sense that led you into your research, if you don't mind me asking?
sure, there were a lot of them. One of them was, did Jesus uphold divine law? So at Mount Sinai, God gives Moses a law that he says is a way of life. Ezekiel 33, verse 15 says, walk in my statutes of life. So there's the idea that when not just a small group of people, but when humanity walks in that way of life, life becomes self-perpetuating. My first question was, did Jesus uphold divine law? I was really surprised that in many verses he does. It's like everybody thinks the law is nailed to the cross. They want to take this arbitrary look at the law and say it's just kind of rigid rules aren't really good for humanity. But there's lots of verses in the New Testament, 1 Corinthians 9:9, for instance, that talk about the law being good for humanity and being beneficial. So if this law is so good, why do we do away with it? Why do we think that it's no longer relevant? And when I look around today, what do we see? Everybody has a different definition of right and wrong. Now you have professors, you have people in universities teaching our kids that stealing is okay. If you want it, just go take it. It's okay to
Wow.
rob. It's okay to kill. Yeah, these are major, like Harvard University, UCLA, major universities where these professors are teaching these ideas.
In what context of speaking are they saying we're at the end of the world? You know how they show those programs where they're like, for one day, the people get to go out and they are stealing and robbing. I forgot the name of it, but it's a movie that has like three different, it's a series where it's part one, part two, part three. What's it called?
Hunger Games, maybe?
No, it's not Hunger Games. It's another one where people are locked down for that one day and they're afraid that people are coming in. I don't remember the name of it, but it sure does make you think, what would I do if we had that happen in real life? How would we protect our goods in our house? Will we board ourselves all in? I'm wondering if they were thinking about the movie and it was a hypothetical or something, because that just seems so like totally lacking integrity to teach something like that on a college level.
Yeah.
You know that it's okay to go out and steal and just take whatever you want. Like, that doesn't even it sounds horrible.
But you find one of the tactics that are used is undermining a strong identity. I find in religion, many times, you are taught that you can never be righteous. No matter what you do, you can never be good enough. And
Which
I think
makes it seem hopeless.
no matter how much you try, you can never get on God's good side, or what you do will never be good enough in his sight. So why bother?
But yet I made you in the image and likeliness of me. So that means like if I'm made in the image and likeliness of God, that would mean that I could, I guess that's like just with legs and
Oh,
having the ability to have a brain. There's so much, like that I want to ask you that my brain is just racing all over the place. So I can't get to the big question yet because we just started the show. And you guys have to buy the book to find out, but I'm going to get you some information
see,
where we'll know. So, when you were doing your research, you said that at some point in book one, you kind of was like, I don't know. But then you did go back on the side of like, okay, all the evidence points to truth. What do you think about the rumors that we've heard that so much of the Bible is missing and that it is super contradictory? Did you
so,
find that that was true?
so let me start with the Old Testament. It's also called the Tanakh, the Jewish term. What I find within the Old Testament, there is a lot of cogency. There's not contradiction. What a lot of times people perceive as contradiction is just the hierarchy of laws. For instance, judgment is going to be ruled by a higher level of laws. You have commandments, statutes, judgments, laws, and commands, and they all have different functions. You wouldn't take a constitutional law necessarily and apply it in a courtroom, although those constitutional ideas govern the laws of the courtroom, if that makes sense. So you see a lot of that in the Old Testament. You see a lot of self-fulfillment in history. A lot of the prophecies in the Old Testament were fulfilled with Assyria and Babylon. The one prophecy that has not been fulfilled, and there's like 60 of these prophecies, is that God will take all of Israel, their modern day descendants, and will one day, through this divine exodus, restore them back to the land. That prophecy is 60 times mentioned in the Old Testament. So there you don't find so much contradiction. But when you get to the New Testament, there is a lot of tension between the core foundational ideas in the Old Testament versus the New Testament. And that is what I really struggled with, because when I saw that everything was consistent here and I could build a very firm foundation, and I saw that it was right, it was good, it made sense, it was balanced. Then over here, I'm like going, okay, does this fit? And that's where I really struggle.
I used to love reading the New Testament and embracing it more than I did the Old Testament. And I think what it was is I just absolutely loved the book of Matthew, Mark, and John. I love when they talked about, I go to prepare a place for you in my father's house. There's many mansions. And it was like all of the areas in the Bible where Jesus was actually here and spoke, and it was more about his presence. I found that I enjoyed understanding what they said was the beginning of the book of Genesis, and how on day one this was made, let there be light, and all the different things, and how every day there was something, and on the seventh day there was rest. But then once we get into the other books, I would find that for me, I had a really hard time of my attention. I couldn't keep up. I was like, wait a minute, where did the other people come from? I was so caught up on those details that I found myself as a like 11-year-old girl and a 15-year-old girl frustrated that no one could answer the questions for me. When Cain slain Abel, killed the other one, and then he was allowed to wander in the world for the whole rest of his days. How did he end up with a wife and kids? Because I think like later on it talks about him having a family, and I was like, how's that possible if in the Garden of Eve they were the only ones? It was Adam and Eve, and I was really caught up so much on the story that it ruined it for me to where I was like, I just don't even, and no one ever can answer me. So I just moved on and went to the New Testament and embraced it. And I loved the book of Proverbs because I thought, regardless of if you're a believer in it or not, that it was great wisdom that anyone could really use and benefit from. And so that's what I had did for some years where the New Testament was like my thing. And I was like, oh, it makes me feel so warm and fuzzy. And then the stories, but I am today not a very religious person because I find that there is a lot of dogma. I just had to share with you my experience where I would be like, "Oh, I'm so fluffy." And I just had all of this hope in it and a lot of unanswered questions, and it was just not considered as respectful or welcomed to question to have the kind of questions that I had. There was no safe space for that. It was almost like this feeling of, "You're going to go to hell because you're asking those types of questions." Mine had got pretty deep where I was wanting to know the details.
My friends and I call that the left Buddha fellowship. Welcome to the church, but leave your questions at the door.
Yeah.
And I'm very blessed that I have met a lot of people along this journey, and they have questions too. They ask hard, difficult questions.
Are they allowed to ask them?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, nothing's off limits. Now, if it's devious, well, that's off limits. But it's a very broad open. As long as we're sticking with the evidence, then we want to know truth. How are you going to know if you don't ask? At one point in time, the Catholic Church had a monopoly on all the discussions. And if you ask questions, you wouldn't just be kicked out of the church. You could be burned at the stake.
Yeah.
You look at Galileo, you look at all the very early astronomers. They had it very rough, but they paved the way for us today. So we can question. And Thomas Kahn, in his book, The Theory of Scientific Revolutions, he talks about how, oftentimes it's not new evidence that you find, but it's new questions and new discussions being applied to that evidence, where all of a sudden you have this revolution, whether it's technology, industry, or something like that. It just comes from asking the right questions.
Questions were welcome.
Well, we were a bunch of black sheep. We never really fit in anywhere because we asked questions. We kind of left our organized religion because it wasn't satisfying us. It was an organization meant to support an organization. Once you put a name to yourself, it's really hard to change that. What happens if you have new truth? One of the prophecies that we have in Isaiah and Daniel is that in the latter days, the lies we've inherited, that's, I think, Jeremiah 9:9, the lies we've inherited from our forefathers, all of a sudden we'll see those lies, we'll challenge them, and we'll let go of them. We'll actually come back to God, we'll embrace truth. But it's this original pure nugget, that Abraham had, that Moses had, that has been corrupted by man. God gave truth, but then, and this is I am a very, very big proponent of divine law. I also have some YouTube teachings and discussions on it. I show how the law of Moses is totally different than the Hammurabi Code. It's different than the Hurrian laws. It's different from the Lipit Ishtar Code. It's different from all the ancient law codes. And law codes are important because they set the standard of morality. Law establishes right and wrong for society. It's not this, generic black and white, these shades of, gray where it's like, I can get away with this. But it makes it so everybody's on the same page and you can have amazing unity. You mentioned the Sabbath. The thing about the Sabbath and what I see in society, especially our fast-paced world, where everybody has to work. The economy isn't doing so well, so everybody's working. I know people working 2 and 3 jobs. They work 7 days a week, 360 days a year. They may take a few days off, but we really have made slaves of ourselves. We have put ourselves, it's self-inflicted. The socioeconomic system has created this, but we have also participated in that. When you look at the Sabbath, it's a day where you get to pause, reflect, rejuvenate. You get to say, what did I do well last week? What do I want to improve on? I mean, it's just so amazing to catch your breath, have that divine rhythm, and to, have that day, reflect on God, spend with your family. Our families are falling apart because we don't spend enough time.
How does faith, evidence, and the modern believer, all of these things collectively go together? What would be important for the modern Christians and Jews to revisit about some of the foundational questions with open minds and scholarly honesty, like where you're finding things that may not be what everyone thought it to be? How do they bring in the faith and the evidence and keep doing research without losing their, you know what I mean?
So I think our teachers, our pastors, our priests, they have really taught us that if we question, that if we ask hard questions, we will lose our faith.
Yes.
I can say in my personal journey, yes, I did come through that because I did have to ask very hard questions. And there were no teachers. There's nobody like me out there. In many ways, I felt like a pioneer. So I had other friends that were on that caravan with me. So it wasn't just me. But we asked hard questions and we didn't give up. We kept seeking. One of the promises that you find in Deuteronomy chapter 4 is that if you seek me, you will find me. That is one of God's promises. I found that to be true. When I first began, this was back, okay, I guess I'll give a date, like 1999, early 2004. I did put God on trial. I said, is he righteous? Is there evidence? I started with archaeology, ancient Israel, and I found that every story that the Bible tells through the Judges era, King David, and the monarchy, not only do we have archaeological evidence supporting that, some of it down to the very year for the present archaeological dating done by scholarship, but you also have epigraphic, meaning written records from ancient Assyria. And they will tell a similar story from another perspective of a story that we have in the Bible, but it confirms that the event occurred. That right there was huge. I also did chronology. The chronology, biblical chronology, has what I found were only 3 errors, but the rest of about 60 points of interaction, or 60 different, this king reigned after that king, ascension dates and all of that, they're perfect. So when you have 3 errors out of 60, that's not bad at all. Very good accuracy. But then when it came to divine law, I had questions. There's protocols for health, not to eat unclean meats. For instance, pork, shellfish, all of those things are forbidden. So I said, okay, is God just saying do this because he just wants us to be different? Or is there something to it? So I dug into the research and I found that every single time unclean meats have higher rates of toxicity. They have higher rates of parasitic. If you eat those meats, you're actually eating parasites. Ew. And now what we're learning is that cancers and other diseases are actually caused by parasites. Sometimes you can't even see them. And so every time I researched, I thought God said, don't do this, and this is bad for us. Then there's also prohibitions about having intercourse during a woman's period. I found, mainly from Islamic scholarship, that women who have intercourse during menses have higher rates of ovarian cancer. They have higher rates of endometriosis. Circumcised men have much better health. They have lower rates of STDs, lower rates of HPV. They also have lower rates of penile cancers. their female partners also have an eightfold decrease in cervical and ovarian cancers. And that study came off of a study concluded in 2014. It was done on 7 continents. It spanned something like 200 countries. It didn't matter your race, your ethnicity, your religious creed. If a man was circumcised, every single time there was better health.
Wow.
A 2016 John Hopkins study came out just based on data inside the United States with the growing trend to no longer circumcise our male children. They found it was costing $16 billion in healthcare related expenses.
Wow.
That's a lot of money
Yes.
spent on disease care for something that could be totally preventable. So as I went through the law, I began to see, oh my goodness, this thing is real. Nobody would have known not to eat pork. Nobody would have not to eat shellfish. No guy is going to think about cutting off, that little skin there. And trust me, no guy is going to come up with that. So it shows the hand of God, and there's reason for it. With male circumcision, it isn't just being circumcised. He says to do it on the 8th day. And that 8th day, babies have a higher rate of prothrombin and also of vitamin K, which are essential in blood clotting. So, if you're going to cut that off, the baby has the mechanisms to deal with that so that there's no health risks. So I was just really blown away. And there's another promise in Exodus 15, verse 24. It says, if you are faithful and just to keep all of the statutes and judgments that I put before you this day, I will put none of these diseases upon you that I put upon the Egyptians. So me being the inquiring person that I am, I asked, what diseases do the ancient Egyptians have? So thankfully, modernly, we have MRI scans, we have tissue scans that have been run through DNA analysis, modern technology. And guess what? The number one disease was in ancient Egypt.
What was that?
Heart disease, cardiovascular diseases. Guess what the number one disease today is?
Is it heart disease?
It is. Heart disease.
Wow.
Yep. Cancer, osteomyelitis, osteoporosis, all the things we deal with today are evidenced in ancient Egypt. These studies are really only good for about 30 years because Jews stopped practicing a lot of the Torah. The Torah is the first 5 books where the divine law is laid down. For about a 30-year period, you could do research on Jews at Mount Sinai Medical Center in New York. And every single time you researched it, and no matter the study, they were always healthier. They had fewer rates of cancer, fewer rates of everything. That doesn't hold true today because our food supply is very contaminated with chemicals. There's been a really big movement in Judaism not to obey divine law. Just kind of follow the rabbi. It's like traditional Christianity will do that with Jesus or a pastor. Get your emotional high or whatever it is you need for the week, your motivational talk like Zig Ziglar. But there's never any meat behind it. At some point, it ends up being very empty because it's founded on words that don't really better your life and provide deeper meaning and a better outcome.
Did you find that in all the different cultures that the story repeated itself, but it was just being advanced?
So there's been many books written on the Jesus story. And you find that it comes in many different flavors. He's often seen as, he's always a son of God. And so here's a tad bit that blew me away. And this was my final linchpin. The question I had to answer before I could go, does this fit with the Old Testament or not? And that is when Nebuchadnezzar says that there are 4 men in the fiery furnace, and the 4th is like the Son of God. Who do Christians think that is?
Jesus.
Do we have any evidence that Nebuchadnezzar accepted Israel's religion?
No, I don't think we do.
So the king of Babylon was a high priest in the Babylonian religion and pagan religion. He would have embraced his own nation's theology. In Babylonian theology, Tammuz was a savior deity and son of God. So when he says the fourth is like the son of God, there's no reference to Jesus. He's referring to Tammuz. And the New Testament has contradictions that challenge me because in the Old Testament, we find that God is a righteous judge. He distinguishes between the righteous and the unrighteous. He rewards the righteous with prosperity, blessings, good health, and conversely, the wicked are judged. They face hardship, or if their crimes are heinous enough, they're going to be put to death. Deuteronomy 28, Leviticus 26 really go through that. And they're called caustic laws, where it's an if then. If you do this, this will be your outcome. But if you don't do that, that will be your outcome. And we as parents often do that. If you get into drugs and alcohol, you're going to have a hard life. And God does the same thing with us because everything he tells us to avoid are things that are harmful to us. When you follow divine law, it naturally brings about promises that are there. But this idea of God as judge is where God separates the righteous and the wicked. He judges justly. But what I struggled with in the New Testament is that all of a sudden he becomes this God where there is no separation. He rains fire and brimstone down equally upon the righteous and the unrighteous. There's no separation. And my question is that a righteous God? So that was one of the big issues that I struggled with in my journey and through all the evidence that I've considered.
I don't think I can ask the question, does Jesus exist? Because would that ruin the whole experience of reading the book?
I can tell you this. I do provide a lot of archaeological evidence, historical evidence, things that other scholars like Bart Ehrman, he is the hands down, top scholar on New Testament studies.
Oh.
I cover some evidence that is controversial that neither atheists nor Christians like to cover because it's controversial evidence, but it shows very much that Jesus very likely was a historical person. The question really becomes, was he man? Was he God? And what was his purpose? I do leave a big cliffhanger at the end of the book, something that I just leave it where my journey was at that particular time. How do you have Jeremiah when he condemns human sacrifice? And he says of God, I never thought of it. It never even came to my mind. So how do you have a God who says that human sacrifice never came into his mind? And then we have a whole religion based on human sacrifice where God sacrifices his son, an innocent son, for the sins of others. That really troubled me because that's a total contradiction in the very foundation of an entire belief system.
I personally think that what I believe is not why we're here right now. I do actually believe that Jesus was a real person that was here. I could not wrap my brain around the sacrifice of my own child because I'm a mother. But it was always like explained so that we could have everlasting life. There's a lot of things that don't really make sense to me, but you just go with the flow, and those are your secret thoughts, so to speak. But I do think that spirituality and religion are two different things to me. And I feel like there's sometimes a lot of dogma, but I love the fact that you are a scholar because it means you present facts to support the outcomes in your books. And I think that's an amazing thing. Most of us are out here going on what we just believe. And so you're presenting facts as to whether or not something is a yay or a nay. I've heard stories about how it's the same story, that's being told in the Bible, but the characters change when you go back really far. It's like the same story, but just different names. And
Well, the flood, for instance, we have the flood is in almost every culture from Assyria, India, China, and even South America.
wow.
So the question becomes, and I really find that there is a dividing line in one's belief. You're either going to believe that the whole world had truth at one point in time. There really was a historical event that everybody recorded. Things are always going to be different because languages are different.
Right.
We call it cognates. So when you have a word that sounds similar today, shampoo is shampoo in English, but in French it's shampoo. So those are cognate. They sound very, very much alike. And in the Bible, we have a lot of cognates where they have similar sounds, similar meanings. In early literature, these stories are there. Even the Garden of Eden is there. So the question becomes, and this is the dividing line, do you see that the whole world at one time had truth? These are real life histories. The pagan ones are mixed with a lot of mythology, where you don't find that in the Hebrew text. Even though there's a myth with it, the core history is that there, or do you think there was no truth whatsoever until God revealed it to Abraham or Moses? And your answer to that question really determines whether you're going to eventually become an agnostic or an atheist, because there is even similarity with the Mosaic law and some points of the Hammurabi Code, like the Talion laws, eye for eye, tooth for a tooth. And today people will take a rigid understanding of that. It's like, I got to go chop off an arm. But what that really meant was that the punishment should fit the crime and it shouldn't be excessive, being too much, but it shouldn't be too lenient. It makes a lot more sense.
Yes. I have to ask, you talk about 7 universal precepts of truth. Can you briefly outline them and their significance in uncovering spiritual deception? Is that like a duplicate question, you would say, or?
So 6 of these are universal to every field of study, whether it's medicine, science, cosmology, geology, they are the same. So the very first idea, the very first precept is that it is constant. In other words, it's going to be the same yesterday and the same tomorrow. For instance, when we look at Newton's third law, for every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. That's a law of physics because every time we try an experiment, we get the same results. And the same thing with truth. When God says it in Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, when he says something, it's constant. It does not change. There's not contradiction to it. And later on, when there is contradiction to it, that should put our antenna up and go, wait a minute. Is this person speaking truth or are they not? This puts us in the driver's seat. It enables us to direct our own paths wisely and not be led astray, not be deceived. The second one is fidelity. It is the fact that even in the details, you're going to have that constancy. One of the examples I give is that when God curses Cain after the Garden of Eden, he says, have trouble producing food off the land.
We froze a little bit. So you said that he would have trouble producing fruit off the land?
Yes, that was a curse against Cain. The ground itself was cursed. But when you go to Israel's curses, that curse is never repeated. It's totally different. The other thing that you find is faithfulness. One of the definitions that it gives God is that he is a faithful God. If he gives a promise for us to wrap our minds around today because we're not used to their own hurt, keeping their words so strongly. But that is what God does. He keeps his own word. He doesn't go back on it. If he made a promise, that promise stays. Even if a group of people like ancient Israel rebel against God's word, his word still stands. You find that Moses' sin and striking the rock instead of talking to it like God told him to. God had said, I'll give Israel water if you go talk to the rock. Well, Moses sinned and he struck the rock, but God still gave Israel water. Moses' sin did not prevent Jehovah from fulfilling his promise. Same thing with a Judean prophet who didn't obey God. Even though he spoke in God's name and said, this is what's going to happen, even though that Judean prophet later disobeyed, what he spoke in God's name still came to pass. So that idea of constancy, faithfulness, fidelity. The other one is righteousness. Righteousness is acting according to divine law. This is really important because most people have the idea of a God who is not bound by anything. God can do whatever he wants. He's the emperor. If he doesn't like Johnny, he can just take Johnny out. If he doesn't like your family, what you're wearing or what you did, God can do whatever he wants. He's the king. But that's not what we find in the Hebrew text. There we find a God that is confined to obey his own law. That limits what he can do. He can't go kill an unrighteous person. If you ran a red light and nobody saw you, he's not going to come after you and give you a penalty that far exceeds your crime. The idea that God is only righteous because he is a God without iniquity and that he is righteous because he obeys that law is a really key understanding. The other thing is that righteousness is not arbitrary. We have this idea of this arbitrary God that is not bound to any rule of law. We almost see God like Stalin or Hitler. In many ways, we kind of make God, the creator, into the devil in some of the ways that we think about him.
I think that came about for some people because they were saying that God actually wiped out the most number of people per the Bible. I don't know if they said it was 2 million people. There was a massive amount of people. My level of understanding isn't even as high as your studies. I'm still in the peon stage of like, well, the little tiny things that don't make sense that probably don't really even matter. Because you know what I'm
Matter. They do
Oh.
matter, though. Let's go back to what you said about God wiping out people. When we look at Leviticus 18, it states that God did drive the Canaanites out of the land because they were marrying, they were committing homosexual acts. They were, marrying their very close relatives. They were, it says, perverting the land. And it says, when the land becomes perverted, I will spew them out. We also know that in early history, they were partaking in human sacrifice, something that is an abomination to God. So you find that these nations, if you look at Genesis 15, I believe it's verse 16, when God makes the promised land covenant with Abraham, he says, I am going to give you the land of the Amorites, but I can't do it right now because the sins of the Amorites have not yet come to the full. So there's this idea that God can't act during Abraham's lifetime. He can't act in his son's or grandson's lifetime because he knows it's going to take longer for them to reach this point of degradation to where society is so wicked that the land can't bear it anymore. And the story of Lot, the messengers that come to Lot, is a good example of the wickedness of the land. Strangers couldn't even come to the city without them being threatened with murder or whatever else the story implies.
It feels like we're almost there now. Sometimes when I turn on the television, it is so depressing. You hear about all this, it's so much going on. Ever since I was a young girl, I would hear we're coming to Judgment Day. They would talk about things like that. And I would sit and go, wow, if I were like the Father, I don't know that I could have that much patience to allow it to continue. So you could see how when they reached a certain point of self-destruction, that's where they were heading. The flood was to give a clean start. per the story, right? And all of the other things were to give it a fresh start. But it seems like we're in a situation where there's just a lot going on. What do you say to the people who are constantly suffering on repeat? You say, hey, well, you chose this life. This is the soul that you chose to come in as. And you hear those things, and it's like, I guess they're supposed to be learning to get to the next level in their lifetime. But I do believe that there's something I feel like we're not here alone. You know what I'm saying? So I am not an atheist. I believe that there is definitely a higher source, the creator, and people can call it or refer to it as what they feel most comfortable. Some people say Yahweh, some people say God, some people say Lord, some people say Christ. And they use a lot of different names for the same energy source, which is supposed to be an energy of love. I do believe that there's something because I can feel it.
Well, God says that he breathed life into us and that life is energy. Definitely, especially when we are doing what's right. God says that he won't hear us when we depart from his ways. But when we seek him, we'll find him. We can be connected. One of the reasons why I gravitate so much to the idea of law solidifying our connection with God is because there's so many promises that if we walk in his ways, we'll have that relationship. Deuteronomy 4:6-8 says that he gave us all of his laws so that we would be a group of people where no nation on earth had a close relationship with him as what we would. To me, it just says it all. If you follow this pattern, this path of life, you will have a closer relationship with me. No nation will have justice and righteousness as you will, and you'll be my people. I just find that it is so comforting. It's so meaningful. You know, we go around our lives and everybody is searching for meaning and they're not finding it.
Right.
They're undermining their identity. They're trying to change who they are. Nobody is proud of their heritage. It's like, no, embrace it. God has made each of us the way we are for a purpose. We all have something to contribute. God is the God of everybody, but he has revealed one way to live, universal for all humanity. It takes away the contradiction because when I look at Christianity, there's 350,000 different sects of Christianity, 7 major sects of Judaism, far more than that when you get into it, because everybody has a different opinion. I found that everybody creates God in their own image. Rather than God revealing to us, we are defining who God is for ourselves. It's a very humanistic approach where we say, this is who you are going to be. This is the God I'm going to worship. And when I looked at those 350,000 different sects of Christianity and Judaism, they can't all be right. And I love truth. I am a truth seeker. So my question is, how do we cut through that? How do we find, if God hasn't lied to us, if God hasn't said to seek him in vain, where truth is unknowable, then how do we discover him? The real him, not the one that we create. How do we find the real thing where there isn't my version of him and your version of him? And I found that when we return to that law code, it really has that way of life that and even in the Hebrew scriptures, it talks about that way of life being a path of eternal life. That was something I was never taught growing up.
Yeah.
And so I just find it so full of hope, such full of unity. You know, teachings like don't defraud your brother, the idea that you don't commit adultery. There's just so many layers there that are easy, very, very easy. When you look at Deuteronomy 30 verses 11-16, it says, this way is not too hard for you. It's very easy. It's in your mouth and in your heart that you can do it.
Nice.
And then that's followed by, I've set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Choose life. And that's where I think we all are today. Choose life. We all inherit something different. But I think the tools are there for us to find God and to have that better way of life.
If for someone who was interested in buying the book, you mentioned it earlier, and I'm bringing us back to that place, like what they can find in the book. And the title of the book is Does Jesus Exist? The Quest for Biblical Truth and the Suffering Servant in Our Modern World. What is it that they're going to find in this book? And is this book only for someone who is a believer, or is it specific to a certain audience?
It's really for anybody who wants truth. If you have a heart for truth, if you love justice, you love righteousness, and especially if something just feels off. The contradictions of religion, you have Baptists, Episcopalians, Catholics. If those sects of religion and why are we there? And how can we heal those divides? If you wrestle with any of those questions, if you've ever wondered about Jesus, who is he? How did he fit into the bigger picture? Or contradictions with the New Testament and the Old Testament? All of these things are things that I share that were part of my journey and will totally resonate with the reader. I hope that it will bring peace and take away some of the things, those ideologies, those questions that we struggle with, and provide a very firm foundation to renew your faith.
I love that share. Is that what you would hope the readers would take away? Is that it would renew their faith if they were someone that was on the fence? And
so it would renew their faith, but I think at the same time reform their faith. Because if you just stay stagnant, if you just stay in that status quo, you're not going to grow. If you think of a workout program, if you just do that same workout program, hitting the same weights with the same intensity, first of all, you're going to start breaking and wearing down your cartilage and some of your joints. I think we do that in our spiritual life because we don't realize that parts of our faith are breaking, parts of our belief system are becoming unpinned until it's too late. And there's that crashing crisis where if your faith, if it's built on lies, if it's built on faulty premise, and you question it and you adjust that workout routine to where you're hitting new machines, you're doing new things, you're considering new evidence, all of a sudden you're going to get gains. You're going to grow in a way that was unimaginable. Anytime you change your intensity, anytime you pick up and do new muscle growth groups, there's going to be a little bit of pain with that. The old saying, no pain, no gain. But at the end, the reward pays off 100-fold. Nothing can compare to the feeling that you get, the stability that you have, the strength that you have from asking those hard, difficult questions and finding the answers, finding a resolution that is righteous, just, and fits the evidence.
so you give people permission to ask questions and read the book. This is a great book. And so the name of the first book, both of the books, they can find them on, where can they find them?
They can find the first book on Amazon. That's Yahweh Exists, Volume 1. The second book, Does Jesus Exist? It's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, just about any book distributor. You can find it all over the world on every book selling platform.
This is a big question. Does Jesus exist? And I know that if I were in a bookstore and I seen the title of the book, I would definitely pick it up because I'm like, I want to know, what do you think? What did your studies reveal? How did you connect all the dots for whatever the outcome was, all the information in between to get to that question? This is definitely a book that is going to be a great read for everyone. A lot of people have probably had that question, but never had the courage to ask. Many people are walking around in fear of, I'm afraid to even challenge anything, regardless of the outcome, So thank you so much for having the courage to investigate, to ask questions, and to, more importantly, want the answers and to share them with all of us. I love that.
Thank you so much. I have enjoyed our conversation.
I've enjoyed talking with you as well. What would you like to leave our listeners with before we end our episode? And is there anything that we have not talked about that you feel is important to add into the conversation?
When you read, Does Jesus Exist? It does leave with a little bit of a cliffhanger. I am following up with a 3-part series on the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 and digging in deep, covering information that has never been published before, sticking straight with the text. My platform is very much a sola scriptura. So when we stick with that text, we can't be led astray by man. And whether it's a pastor wanting to make money off of you or an organization wanting to make money off of you. But when we look at our world today, we're in a crisis. I don't think we realize that the source of our crisis is a crisis of ideology. The violence that we see, the rhetoric, whether it is religious or political, it all comes down to the fact that each of us have conflicting religious ideas that we hold on to. So the only way to ease that is to find a path where there is unity that can transcend all of that, assuage the objections with evidence that gives peace, instills righteousness, and provides a better way of life where there's health, prosperity, and brotherly love. I hope that you will find that in the pages of research and all the evidence that's presented.
I love it. Thank you so much for sharing. The title of the book is Does Jesus Exist? The Quest for Biblical Truth and Suffering, Servant in Our Modern World. You guys, this book is available where all books are sold and also on Amazon. All of the information is in the show notes. You can connect with Jodell and definitely check out the book. And books, you guys, I always say this on almost every episode, they make the absolute best gifts. And books are still amazing to hold. I feel like once you give someone their first couple of books, it inspires them to start their own mini library. I was 19 and I didn't have much in the way of financial overflow where I could afford to buy a ton of books, but I loved reading so much that I didn't really have a lot of furniture, but I had a little mini bookshelf that went to around my waist or a little bit lower than that. It had only one shelf in the middle, so you could put something cute on top. You had the one shelf in the middle and the one at the bottom. And I was excited when I would get a book that was a gift. It was something that I never told anyone that I wanted, but when someone would give me one, I would just be so excited. I know recently someone gifted me with the book and I was like, yay, like a big kid, So help someone start their bookshelf. In 2025, help them get started or help them to continue to allow it to grow. The gift of books. Thank you so much, Jodell.
Thank you, Shanta. I appreciate it. This has been a wonderful conversation that we've gotten to know each other.
Yes, absolutely. I enjoyed talking with you and I look forward to talking with you again. You have a series coming out, so you have a platform to come back again and again.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jodell. I appreciate this authentic talk. You guys, if this conversation stirred your curiosity, don't stop here. Dive deeper into the questions that challenge tradition and inspire truth. Grab your copy of Does Jesus Exist? And explore Jodell Onstott's groundbreaking research for yourself. Share this episode with someone ready for an authentic conversation about faith, history, and what the Bible really says. Authentic Talks 2.0, where real stories, real people, and real truth meet. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other, and make sure you stay authentic. Thank you again for tuning in. I'm Shanta with Authentic Talks.